Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the AHM YouTube channel. Today, we are going to be talking about the second in our series of the AHM Connect teaching with Scott Engelman, who is on right now. How you doing today, Scott?
I'm doing great, Steve. How about yourself?
I am doing well. It's good to see you this morning.
You too.
I just want to thank everyone for tuning into the YouTube channel, and just want to encourage you guys that as you watch the video today, feel free to ask comments in the comment section below this video, and we'll be able to respond to you through the chat function below. You can also reach out to us on the AHM 4Life website, and we will be able to get back to you that way. Lots of ways you can connect with us. But for this video, if there's questions specifically about the teaching, it is very convenient just to ask the questions in the comments below, and then we'll be able to circle back to you and answer those questions right there for others to see as well. And we do encourage questions and comments below as you go through this. So I think with that, Scott, I will turn it over to you and we'll get started. I'll just put your camera up so everybody can see you as you teach if you're ready.
I'm ready. Thank you,
right.
Steve.
Pin your video and you're all set.
Okay, thank you.
Hang on
Morning, guys.
I'm going to hang on one second. I actually flip-flop this on you. Sorry, guys. All right, go ahead, Scott.
Okay. Morning, guys. Good to see you again this morning, or be with you again this morning. And last Friday morning, if you were with us, you know that we started this new series, AHM CORE. It's really not a new series. We originally taught it as M3 CORE about 15, 20 years ago. I don't remember now how long it was, but it was some time ago. And it really became the core for everything that we have been teaching since then. So this is kind of the foundation of what everything AHM and what we've been teaching and what we're about is built upon. And so the board asked if we could do this again, and I agreed. And so here we are. The purpose of AHM CORE, just to get started here again, is to call men back to a life that is centered in God. We live in a world today that has self at the center, and everything in life revolves around self, so that we understand our paychecks, we understand our marriages, we understand our children, we understand our jobs, we understand our possessions, everything in light of ourself. And if there is a God, we understand him in light of us. He revolves around us and exists for us, just as all things exist for us to make us happy and to give us a sense of fullness and purpose in life. Well, what we're saying is that isn't how God has designed life to be, and how God has designed life to be and how reality works is with God at the center and us revolving ourselves around him, so that everything in our lives, our marriages, our jobs, our money, everything has its understanding and purpose and meaning as it revolves around him. So we are committed in this series to call us back to a life centered in God. Now, this series consists in two parts. First, who we are as men, weeks 1 through 3. And then secondly, what men are for, weeks 4 through 6. In the first section, we're going to focus on identity. In the second section, we're going to focus on function, our mission, what we're here to do in this world. So who we are and what we're for. When it comes to identity, we're going to see that we are dependent creatures made of dust, created to live for the transcendent glory of God. In the second part, weeks 4 through 6, when it comes to our function, we're going to see that we are male image bearers designed to reflect the life-giving power of God. So dependent creatures and male image bearers, identity and function. Now, last time, if you're with us, week 1, just a quick review here, we saw that we really laid the groundwork that this whole series is going to be built on. And the thing we saw was that God created everything to give him glory. Colossians 1:16 says, all things were created by him and all things were created for him. In other words, everything that exists has one primary purpose, and that is it exists to the glory of God, to give God glory. We saw that God's glory, if that's true, then we said, what is God's glory? And we said that God's glory is all that he is. Everything that makes God God is God. His holiness, his power, his sovereignty, etc., etc. All that he is his glory. We also said that it is intrinsic to his nature. And what we mean by that, just as heat is intrinsic to fire and cold is intrinsic to ice, so glory is intrinsic to God, which means, while we're going to talk about giving God glory, there's really no way we can give God more glory than he already has. It's intrinsic to him, and neither can we take away his glory. It's who God is. And what we also saw last time is it is his glory alone. He shares his glory with no one. And then we saw last time also that God reveals his glory because God wants his glory to be seen. God is a God of glory. It's all that he is. It's intrinsic to him. It's his alone. And he wants you and I, as creatures made in his image, to see and to experience that glory. And so the question then was, how has God revealed his glory? We saw that the Bible tells the story of God's glory in three parts. First, God's glory past, which was manifest in this brilliant Shekinah glory, this fire and smoke. And we saw that it was manifest in the Garden of Eden, and then on the face of Moses. It then appeared in the tent and the tabernacle in the wilderness. It appeared in the temple, Solomon's temple in Jerusalem. And finally, it appeared in the person of Jesus. And we see this Shekinah manifest when he is with the two disciples on the hill, and his glory just kind of shines forth for the two disciples to see. And one thing we saw also is that while this glory was brilliant, fire, smoke, and all that, it was only temporary. Because in each of these cases, whenever the glory of God was manifest, man rejected that glory. So then we looked at God's glory future. And we saw that the story the Bible tells us is it's similar, the same as God's glory past, manifest in brilliant Shekinah. But instead of coming in the garden, in the face, in the tent, in the temple, in the person of Christ, it comes in Jesus again in his coming. When he comes again in Revelation chapter 20, he comes with brightness and glory. And it comes in the new creation. There will be no more night, but the glory of God will shine. Revelation 21 and 22. And we're going to see, we saw that while this glory is Shekinah, is brilliant, unlike glory of the past, it's not temporary, it's permanent. And even though in Revelation 20, man tries to reject that glory again, man does not succeed. Jesus succeeds, and his glory is here on this earth to stay. So that's past and that's future, but what about present? If God is a God of glory and he wants us to see his glory, then we should expect that his glory is to be seen today. Where is that glory being seen today? Well, what the Bible tells us in Colossians, or in Corinthians we saw, is that God's glory is presently being manifest in clay pots. And what Paul means by that is in believers, in those who trust Jesus as their Savior. He says, we have this treasure in clay pots, this glory that's in us. And we also see in Corinthians that Paul says that we are temples of the Spirit. And remember that God dwelt in a temple, and wherever God dwelt in that temple, there was the glory of the God that went with it. And so today, God's glory abides in you and me as temples of the Spirit who have believed in Jesus. And while the past was brilliant and temporary, the future will be brilliant and permanent, today it is humble yet revealing. Even though it is a clay pot, it still can be seen. The glory of God can still be seen. And then finally, we concluded that God intends the world to see his glory today through the fragile bodies and broken lives of you and me as Christian men. And if that's the case, the question then we asked was this: what will that look like? If God intends his glory to be seen, and he wants it to be seen through you, a clay pot, a broken vessel, weak and impotent as we are as men, what will that look like? Well, that's where we want to begin today. And we want to answer that question today by asking and then answering three more questions. Number one, what happens when a man lives his life for the glory of God? So we'll back up just a bit. Second question, what happens when a man fails to live his life to the glory of God? God made us to live for his glory. What happens when we do? What happens when we don't? And then thirdly, how do we as men live our lives for the glory of God? If God wants his glory to be seen through us, practically speaking, what will that look like? So those three questions. First question, what happens when a man lives his life for God's glory? Listen to what David says. When a man lives his life for the glory of God, God gives him joy. In Psalm 16, verses 8 and 9, David says this: I have set the Lord always before me. Because he is at my right hand, I will not be moved or not be shaken. Therefore, because the Lord is set before me and he's always at my right hand, my heart is glad and my soul rejoices. What's David saying here? Well, David is saying this. He says, I consider God in everything I do. When I get up in the morning and I go out and I do this and that, I consider God. Every time I do something, I'm considering God. His essence in saying is God is the filter through which everything comes that I evaluate. I evaluate my day. I evaluate my marriage. I evaluate my job. I evaluate my possessions. I evaluate my life, all through the filter of God. And what David is describing here for you and me is really, he's describing a life that's lived for the glory of God. And notice he says, when I live my life for the glory of God, when I consider God in everything I do, and he's the filter through which everything comes, therefore my heart is glad and my soul rejoices. God gives us joy. I want you to note something. This is the opposite message that we get in our culture today, isn't it? Just think with me for a minute. The culture in which we live says that joy comes when self is at the center and everything that revolves around me is going just the way I want it to. When it does, I have joy, but when it doesn't, then I don't have joy, and I work hard and get angry and frustrated, mad, and I try to pull it back around so everything is going my way. What's that song? I have a wonderful feeling. Whoa, what a wonderful day. Why? Everything is going my way. That's what our culture says. When self is at the center and we're able to, through force or through circumstance or through coincidence, everything is going our way. And if there is a God, then we infuse that message into our belief about God. And what we do is say this: God is cooperating with my agenda. In fact, he is sovereign and he is good when he makes everything go my way, and then I have joy. And so then the question is, how can I get God to cooperate with my agenda so everything goes my way so I have joy? And when everything isn't going my way, then I don't have joy, and then either I'm not doing something right to get God to cooperate, or God isn't a good God like we think he is. And when we live like this, when we buy into the message of the culture and we bring our Christianity into it, what it does is it trivializes God because it treats him like a vending machine. Put in the right change, pull the lever, get what I want. It also frustrates the self because we are living from a false reality. Reality where we experience life and joy and peace and shalom only works when we live according to how life has been designed and created, and that is with God at the center, and us and everything else revolving around him. So, question one, what happens when we live our lives to the glory of God? God gives us what? Joy. Second, what happens when we fail to live our life to the glory of God? If God gives us joy when we do, what happens when we don't? Well, what we're going to see here from Paul is that when we fail to live our life to the glory of God, we experience God's present wrath. Listen to what he says in Romans 1:18-20. Paul says, the wrath of God is now being revealed from heaven. This isn't a future wrath that comes after we die and stand before him. This is a wrath that is happening today. The wrath of God is now being revealed from heaven against everyone who suppresses the truth by their wickedness. Since what may be known about God is plain to them. The truth that they suppress is the truth about God, and they are suppressing it because God has made us to know who he is. For since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature, in other words, his glory, have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made, so that people are all without excuse. What's Paul saying? Saying a couple of things. Number one, God's wrath is coming down today on anyone, all men, doesn't matter who they are, who deny the truth about God's glory. God is a glorious God, and when we push that aside, when we ignore it, when we deny it, when we push it down, the result is God's wrath. And he says, such men who push the truth about God's glory down are without excuse. Why? Because God has revealed his glory both inwardly in our conscience. There's something we know that's true about God, and outwardly through creation. We feel it, we know it inwardly, and we see it outwardly. And Paul says when we push that truth down and we deny the glory and reality of God, who he is and what it means for us who have been created by him for his glory, we experience his present wrath. Now Paul continues. Verse 21-24, he says, for although they knew God, they neither glorified him, didn't glorify God, nor give thanks to him for who he is and what he's given. And as a result, listen now, their thinking became empty and their foolish hearts were darkened. They became fools by exchanging the glory of the immortal God for images made to look like a mortal human being. In other words, when they pushed God aside, they began to worship something else. They began to live for the glory of something else. And Paul says here, mortal human beings. Therefore, he says, God gave them over. And he goes on to describe a spiral downward into darkness and to human corruption. And what I want you to see, in essence, he's saying this. We as men experience God's wrath today when we don't give God the glory we know he should have. And God's wrath gives us over to the consequence of our suppression of his glory. And it involves the corrupt desires and foolish choices that we make. In other words, when we choose to no longer glorify God, to push his reality and his glory aside, what happens is we suffer the consequence of living a life apart from the glory of God. And here's his point. God has created everything. He's created every human being to give him glory. And if a man fails to fulfill that purpose, that man then falls under God's present wrath. He experiences it, not something in the future, but in the present today. And that present wrath, Paul explains, is the consequence. It is the consequence of denying God's glory. And what it is, it's a life blinded by self-consumed emptiness, that spiral downward. They're just trying, he just describes human beings trying to figure out life and to experience pleasure and meaning and purpose, all with themselves at the center, through their own purposes, through their own preferences, through their own feelings. And he says that this can never be satisfied. It can only temporarily be numbed or satiated. In other words, you experience this life that really is an emptiness pursuit pattern of relating. I was made to be filled with the glory of God, and out of that fullness live. But when I denied the glory of God, there's an emptiness that nothing can fill it with. And so I pursue creation. I pursue the glory of creation rather than the glory of God to fill that emptiness. And it never can. It just leaves me empty, and ultimately my soul collapses in on itself. Let me give you two illustrations of this. When we glorify God, he gives us joy, but when we fail to glorify God, we experience his present wrath. First illustration of the first king is King Nebuchadnezzar, who is the great king of Babylon. He's described throughout the Old Testament, but it's specifically in the book of Daniel. In Daniel, we see that he is a king that boasts of his glory, and he's struck down by God, and he becomes a raving maniac. Let me just read, because it's so good just to hear this. In Daniel 4, beginning at verse 28, he says this. Daniel describes a dream of all these kingdoms that's coming and what's going to happen to them, including Nebuchadnezzar. And verse 28 says, all this happened to Nebuchadnezzar the king, i.e., just as the dream said it would. 12 months later, he was walking on the roof of the royal palace of Babylon. And the king reflected and said, is this not Babylon the Great, which I myself have built as a royal residence by the might of my power and for the glory of my majesty? And while the word was in the king's mouth, a voice came from heaven saying, King Nebuchadnezzar, to you it is declared, sovereignty has been removed from you, and you will be driven away from mankind, and your dwelling place will be with the beasts of the field, and you will be given grass to eat like cattle, and 7 years will pass over you until you recognize the Most High is ruler over the realm of mankind and bestows it on whomever he wishes. The idea here is this: God has the glory, and he shares it with no one, except if he chooses. And immediately, verse 33, the word concerning Nebuchadnezzar was fulfilled, and he was driven away from mankind and began eating grass like cattle, and his body was drenched with the dew of heaven until his hair had grown like eagle's feathers and his nails like bird claws. What happened? Nebuchadnezzar failed to give God glory. He took the glory for himself, and Nebuchadnezzar faced the consequence of God's present wrath. It goes on in verse 34 to say this. This is Nebuchadnezzar. When my sanity returned, he says, I came to the sense of what reality is all about. I honored and glorified him who lives forever and whose kingdom never ends. When Nebuchadnezzar failed to glorify God, God gave him over to his present wrath. Another king in the New Testament, King Herod, Acts 12, it describes Herod one day comes together and he sets himself up on his podium and he puts on his best, most glorious robes and garments, and he declares it Herod Day, in essence. and he displays his glory, and everybody's there. They're crying out as he's giving the speech. It's a voice of a God and not a man. It's the voice of a God and not a man. And Herod doesn't correct that. Herod receives the worship as God. Remember what happens? An angel, it says, verse 23, struck him down, and he was eaten by worms and died. Why? Because he did not give God the glory. That must have been pretty dramatic. But what do we learn? When Herod failed to glorify God, God gave him over to the consequence of his choice, which is his present wrath. So what are we seeing here from the Bible then? Well, what I want us to see is this. God is a God of glory, and he is serious about you and I living for that glory. God created everything to give him glory. If we fulfill our purpose for which we were created, ultimately to give him glory, God gives us joy. But when we fail to fulfill our created purpose of giving him glory, like everything has been created to give him glory, we face his present wrath. And what is God's present wrath? A life blinded by self-consumed emptiness that can never be satisfied, only temporarily numbed or satiated. And guys, doesn't that describe life in America today, that's always on the move, that we can never slow down, we can never stop, we can never rest. We have to always be looking for more and doing more. Why? Because we have lived our lives with us at the center, and we're trying to make everything go our way as it revolves around us, including God. And so the first question, what happens when we live to God's glory, our lives to God's glory? We have joy. Second question, what happens when we fail? We experience his wrath. Third question, how does a man live his life for God's glory? If it's so important that we live to the glory of God, if God does what he does when we fail to live to that glory, then it's important that we live and that we know how to live, just not guess. And what I want you to know is that because it is so important to God, God clearly tells us in the Bible how we can live our lives to the glory of God. In fact, there's about a dozen specific ways that the Bible will tell us to do that. And this morning, what I want to do is I want to just give two pillars upon which the rest can be built. In other words, these two are the foundation. Without these, you can't build a life that's lived for the glory of God. So let's look at these two pillars, and then next time we'll begin to look at some of the other things that are built off these two pillars, okay? First pillar that we have to lay to live a life for the glory of God is we glorify God by submitting our lives to Jesus as the center of all things. To Jesus as the center of all things. Listen to what Paul says in Philippians 2. He says, therefore, because Jesus gave himself to die on our behalf, he was obedient to the Father, he humbled himself, he died in our place for our sin. Therefore, God highly exalted him and bestowed upon him the name which is above every name, that at the name of Jesus every knee should bow, where? Of those who are in heaven and on earth, angels and people, and under the earth, and at every tongue should confess that Jesus Christ is Lord, Kyrios, ruler, king, to the glory of God the Father. Now notice, he says, God has exalted the crucified and risen Jesus to be the world's present Lord. In that day in Philippi, Caesar was the Lord to which everyone bowed. And what Paul is saying, no, it's not Caesar that you bow to. It's Jesus. He is Lord and Caesar is not. And when you bow your knee to Jesus and live under his authority with him at the center, you live to the glory of God. When we submit our lives to that present reality, we are living a life to the glory of God. In other words, what am I saying? To live our lives for the glory of God begins with a major shift. And what is that shift? Well, it's this: moving from self at the center to Jesus at the center. From ourselves as our final authority on which we determine what we will do and how we will live, to Jesus as our final authority. And so here's the question. If that's the case, that we live, we are to submit to Jesus, trust him, believe in him, bow to him for the glory of God, why are we so often told today that we as men should believe in Jesus, or trust in Jesus, or come to Jesus, or submit our lives to Jesus? Why are we told that? Well, sometimes we're told that if you submit your life to Jesus and you follow him and believe in him, you'll be a better husband, you'll have a better marriage, you'll have be a better father, you'll have a better family, you'll have a better life, you'll be a better worker, you'll have a better business. All those things, your world will work better if you submit yourself to Jesus. We're also told that if you submit to Jesus and follow him, you'll have better self-esteem, you'll have a less dysfunctional life, and you'll have more self-confidence to move into the world to make things happen. Or we're told that if you believe in Jesus, come to him, you'll receive forgiveness of sin and heaven when you die. Now, the question is this: are these things true? Yeah. When you trust Jesus, you do become better husbands, you do become better fathers and managers and have better self-esteem, et cetera, and you receive forgiveness. Why? Because you're living your life according to reality with him at the center. But are all these things the primary reason we should trust Jesus and submit to him so that we can have a better life? What does Paul say? The primary reason to submit to Jesus, to believe in Jesus, to bow to him, is it glorifies God when our lives are fully submitted to the authority of Jesus as the world's true Lord. He is the final authority. His kingdom is what we live for. And we live our lives around him and for his kingdom. And what I want you to see is this: apart from bowing the knee to Jesus, it's impossible to live to the glory of God. You can't live to the glory of God without bowing to Jesus and submitting your life and my life to him. Listen to what he says in John 5. He says, "He who does not honor the Son does not honor the Father who sent him." Now, what's he saying here? He's saying living life that honors Jesus is where living to the glory of God begins. If I want to honor the Father, I first have to honor the Son. Why? Because I cannot honor the Father without first honoring the Son. And how do you honor the Son? We honor Jesus when we live our lives in full submission to his authority over everything, including us. And when we do, we have present joy. We're filled with him, and out of that fullness, we express ourselves in the world. But when we don't honor Jesus, we cannot live to the glory of God. When we fail to live our lives to his under his authority. In other words, what I'm saying is this: to honor Jesus, you have to submit to his authority, which means that we cannot live to the glory of God, because you cannot honor Jesus with honor God the Father without honoring Jesus. We have to submit to his authority. And when we don't, we experience present wrath, that emptiness pursuit. I got to find something to fill that. So what's the first pillar we build a life to the glory of God on? It is submitting our life to Jesus at the center. The second one is we glorify God by aiming our lives at that purpose. Listen what Paul says in 1 Corinthians 10. He says, so whether you eat or drink or whatever you do all for the glory of God. What's he saying here? He's saying whatever you do, even in the most mundane things of your life, whether it's eating or drinking, taking the garbage out, driving to work, whatever it is, the great all the way to the most mundane things in life, you do it with a conscious effort to do what? Do it for the glory of God. In other words, the glory of God is to be our life's primary objective. Not to make money, not to be a good husband, not to have a good marriage, not to be a good Christian. It's to live our lives for the glory of God. It is to be our primary ambition in life. Our primary ambition isn't to get ahead, it's to live for the glory of God. And sometimes that will do just the opposite of keeping us from getting ahead. Now, an important observation. Aiming our lives at God's glory will not happen by accident. If we are to lay the foundation of God's glory, aiming our life at that God's glory, you need to know it just isn't going to happen because we read the Bible or we're a good person and we think it should. It doesn't happen by accident. It requires a lifetime to train our body and mind and heart to live a God-centered life. Everything in us pulls us to live a self-centered, and so it takes a lifetime. And so know this, it takes time. It isn't going to happen overnight. Second, it involves making daily, hard, difficult choices that when we repeat them and when we make those good choices over and over again, they form God-centered patterns or God-centered rhythms in which our life begins to live in a God-centered way. But while it takes time, I want you to see it requires effort. And because it requires effort and it takes time, what you need to know is it slowly develops into an automatic response where it's like a knee-jerk reaction. Whatever happens, or I drink, or whether I eat, or whether I'm taking out the garbage, or whether I'm driving, whatever happens, my automatic response is I will only and always do whatever glorifies God. So it takes time, it requires effort, and you need patience. Again, it doesn't happen overnight. Let me illustrate what this looks like. Living for God's glory was the fixed pattern and the automatic response that we see in Jesus' life. He says, I seek to honor my Father. I do not seek my own glory, in John 8. In John 12, he says, now is my soul troubled. What shall I say? Father, save me from this hour. But it is for this purpose that I came to this hour. Father, glorify my name. This is hard, but I'm going to make this hard choice because I've been making hard choices all my life to live for your glory. And now that I'm facing the crucifixion and the cross, Father, the automatic response is, Father, glorify thy name. In Luke 22, Father, if you are willing to take this cup of suffering away from me, please do it. Yet I want your will to be done, not mine. Jesus felt the reality of living a life and the difficulty of it. But throughout his life, because he made hard choices when it came to the cross became an automatic response. Why? Because his life was only and always lived to the glory of God. That was his primary objective, and that was his life's ambition. And so Jesus only and always sought to bring glory to the Father, never to himself. And what I want you to see, and what I'm saying is this: Jesus' pattern of living is the model for those whose life is aimed at God's glory. And it takes time, it requires effort, and you need patience. And what I want you to see, guys, it's not about the perfection of my life. It's not about getting everything right, because we won't. But it's about the direction of my life. My life is being aimed at God's glory. It's moving in that direction. Something that might be helpful in terms of developing these patterns and these habits so that it become an automatic response. A book by James K.A. Smith, You Are What You Love, The Spiritual Power of Habit. Again, you can pick that up on Amazon. It would be a great book to just read through if you really are interested in developing these habits that will begin to move your life, aim your life at God's glory. But here's the question that I have. If living a life that glorifies God takes a lifetime to develop, okay, at the end of my life, I look back, yeah, I lived to God's glory, then how can I know right now if my life is being aimed at that purpose? If it takes a lifetime, how can I know now that I'm moving in the right direction? Is there a way to evaluate the current direction of my life, that it's moving towards that? And what I have, guys, is 3 measures that can be helpful, okay? 3 measures. The man whose aim is of his life, it's to glorify God, will, number 1, always prefer God's glory at any cost. Number 2, he will hurt when God is dishonored. And number 3, he will be content to be outdone by others as long as God is glorified. Now let's just go through these very quickly here. Measure number 1. How can I know if my life is being aimed at God's glory? Well, do you prefer God's glory at any cost? Ask yourself that question. Do I prefer God's glory at any cost? The man whose aim is to live his life to the glory of God will desire God's glory no matter what the price, no matter what the cost to himself. This is what Jesus was referring to in Luke 18 when he said, we must be willing to leave everything, father, mother, sister, brother, job, home, everything for his sake. It's the message of Jesus' parable in Luke 14, 28 through 33, when he says, before you count the cost of building this tower, or before you build the tower, make sure you count the cost, because it's going to be costly, and do you have what it takes? It's what Jesus says to us, his followers, in Matthew 16, when he says, if you are going to come after me, you have to take up your cross and deny yourself daily. What's he saying here? If we're going to live for the glory of God, if we're going to bow before Jesus, if we're going to honor him as Lord, it is going to be costly, and we have to be willing to pay that price. Let me give you an illustration from the life of Moses. In Exodus 32, Moses had been up on Mount Sinai with God, meeting with God, receiving the law, the 10 Commandments and all the law that went with it. And he comes down from Mount Sinai, and he sees all the people who were waiting there those 40 days and 40 nights while he was up on the mountain. And he sees that they had taken all the gold from Egypt and they had formed it into a golden calf, and they were worshiping the golden calf. And what does Moses do? Well, Moses takes the law that was written on the stones, and he throws it and he breaks it, and he cries out, who is on God's side? Who wants to live for the glory of God? Step over the line. And the story tells us that the Levites respond by stepping over the line. Now, Moses then turns to the Levites and he says these words. And he said to them, thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, every man of you who stepped over the line, put his sword upon his thigh and go back and forth from gate to gate in the camp and kill every man his brother, every man his friend, and every man his neighbor. In other words, you want to live for the glory of God? You really want to? If you do, it's going to cost you. It's going to cost you your brother. It's going to cost you your friend. It's going to cost you your neighbor. It'd be one thing to say, go take care of the people that you don't like at all, your enemies. But he doesn't say that, does he? He says, do this to the people you love. The question is, did the Levites prefer God's glory at any cost? And so the sons of Levi did as Moses instructed, and about 3,000 men of the people fell that day. They preferred God's glory at any cost. Now, there's a lot of theological questions here about killing and all this that I don't want to deal with now, but you can go to our website. And if you do, you can hit the resource, and under resource, there is a little document that I put together there. It's called Sin and the Loss of God at the Center. Sin and the Loss of God at the Center. You can click on that, and hopefully that will help here. But let me just say this. To summarize here, God asks the Levites to kill the people who committed idolatry against God, right? And while this story is theologically unsettling, how can God ask us to kill people? At its heart is the request for absolute self-denial, right? We don't want to get into the theology, the question of that, but what we do want to see is this. It is a question of, are you willing to live to the glory of God at any price, at any cost? And will the Levites, and this is the question, will the Levites be willing to deny themselves by choosing the glory of God over the people they love? That's the question. And guys, that was the question then, and it's still the question today. And while it will most likely look very different today than it did back then, it's still the question. Will we prefer God's glory at any price and at any cost? That's the question. And that's the first measure that we can use to evaluate, is my life being aimed at the glory of God? Is it moving in that direction? That when I stand back at the end of my life and I look back, I can say my life was a life that was lived to the glory of God. Okay? Second measure, do you hurt when God is dishonored? Do you hurt when God is dishonored? David says in Psalm 69, he says, zeal for your temple, remember that's where the glory of God was, zeal for your temple has consumed me. And the insults of those who insult you, God, have fallen on me. What's David saying here? He's saying, God, I have such a desire, such a passion, such a heart for your glory. I want you to be glorified so much that when someone dishonors you, when someone fails to glorify you, I feel the pain. That's what he's saying. Now, fast forward to the New Testament in John chapter 2. Jesus in the temple driving out the money changers. And John tells us that Jesus fulfilled Psalm 69 in his response to the money changers in the temple. He says, think back when David said this is the heart of Jesus. Jesus hurt when God was dishonored. And so again, the question, what's your response? And what's my response when we see God dishonored, when we see his name, when we see his character, when we see the things that he loves and that are important to him, his ways, when we see all those things dishonored, what's our response? Does it bother you? Does it offend me? Or Do we simply dismiss it and ignore it, or do we just tolerate it and not deal with it? I don't want to have to deal with this. I don't want to have to pay the price of having to deal with it. Does it pain you and break your heart? Does it pain me and break my heart? Or maybe we do more than just dismiss it and tolerate it. Maybe we're entertained by it. Maybe we're amused by it. Maybe we even embrace it. Not so with a man whose life is aimed at the glory of God, because the man whose life is aimed at the glory of God will always hurt when God is dishonored. Henry Martin, a missionary in Persia, once saw a pagan ritual. He witnessed it, he watched it, and he left and he wrote down in his journal, "I cannot endure existence if Jesus Christ is so dishonored." Why did he write that? Because his life was aimed at the glory of God. Henry Martin hurt when God hurt. And so, do you prefer God's glory at any cost? Do we hurt when God is dishonored? And the third measure is this: Are we content to be outdone by others as long as God is glorified? Now, this is a tough one. Are we content to be outdone by others as long as God is glorified? In Philippians 1, Paul says, Paul's in prison, by the way, when he writes this, and he says, "Some, to be sure, are preaching Christ from envy and strife, but some from goodwill." Here I am in prison and I'm looking out what's going on in the Christian community. Some are preaching Christ in goodwill because they love Christ, they love me. Some are preaching Christ not from goodwill, out of envy and strife, out of jealousy, of competition with me. He says the latter, who are doing it with goodwill, do it out of love, knowing that I'm appointed for the defense of the gospel. We're partners with you, Paul, and you can't do it now, so we're going to take up where you have left off because we love you and we love the gospel. We want to be part of it. He says, but the others, the former, proclaim Christ out of selfish ambition rather than pure motives, thinking to cause me distress in my imprisonment. They're believers, but they're looking at Paul and they're saying, "Paul, you're not that great. In fact, God had to shelve you and put you aside, and now watch us. We will show you how to do it. Because obviously you did something wrong that God is punishing you for." What's Paul's response? What then? Only that in every way, whether you're preaching in pretense or in truth, in jealousy or love, in goodness or competition, Christ is proclaimed, and in this I rejoice. What? The proclamation of Christ, I rejoice. Now, 4 observations from this passage. First, Paul's report. Some are preaching Christ from a pure heart, right? Others are preaching him from a competitive, self-exalting spirit. You ever been around somebody that is just, maybe you've never said anything, you just know that there's this competitiveness they have with you, that no matter what you do, they're always trying to outdo you, to show others that you're not quite as good as you think you are, and that you're not always the one that should be the go-to person, that they should be the go-to person. What's Paul's response to that kind of person? As long as Christ is preached, he doesn't care who the human instrument is or the motive that is driving them. Why? Because his entire life was aimed at the glory of God. And as a result, he is content to be outdone by others as long as the Jesus he loved and served was being glorified. In other words, the man whose life is aimed at the glory of God will be willing to take a back seat to others as long as God is glorified. He won't be in competition. He won't be struggling with jealousy and envy. He will not be concerned with personal recognition or who gets the credit. You know, why does he get the credit when I'm the one that really did this? So the question that we have to ask ourselves, the question I have to ask myself, the question we all have to ask ourselves, especially as men who can be very competitive and very self-ambitious, is this: how do we respond when I am overshadowed, when you and I are overshadowed by someone who does what we do better than we do? Or what I do best, somebody else becomes the go-to person and I'm just kind of ignored. What do? Do I get jealous and envious, or am I content as long as God is glorified? So guys, what do we learn today? Well, when a man lives his life for the glory of God, God gives him joy. Why? Because everything that has been created for the glory of God. That's your purpose. And when you fill your created purpose, you experience joy. But likewise, when we fail to live a life that glorifies God, when we fail to live out that one created purpose, that primary created purpose, we don't experience joy. We experience God's present wrath, which is this emptiness pursuit pattern of living. We're empty. We're constantly just trying to fill it with something to satisfy, and it never satisfies. And so if that's the case, we want to live for how we were created. We want to live to the glory of God. We want to live in a way that we experience joy. And for us to do that, number one, it begins by submitting our lives to Jesus as the world's true Lord. He has all authority over Caesar, over our government, over anything that demands anything of us. He has sole authority, and we bow to him as that. And it's also built on a life that's aimed at that purpose. I submit to God's glory. I make him, Jesus, the center. And now everything that's going around me, I'm aiming my life at the center. I'm aiming my life, everything that goes on, so it comes in line with Jesus Christ, his authority, and his centrality in my life. And there are three measures to evaluate that second pillar. If I'm aiming my life, three questions, we could put it like this. Am I preferring God's glory at any cost? Do I hurt when God is dishonored? And lastly, am I content to be outdone by others as long as God is glorified? Those are the three measures to evaluate that second pillar. Now, next time, we got the two pillars, aiming our life at God's glory and the centering our life in Jesus. Those are the two pillars. Next time, we're going to begin to build some practical things the Bible says on these two pillars. But apart from these two pillars, anything else we do, try to build on, we cannot live to the glory of God apart from submitting our life to the centrality of Jesus. Guys, are you doing that? And also by purposefully aiming our lives at the glory of God. It takes time, it takes effort, and it takes patience. It requires patience. It also, guys, requires community. We can't do this alone. We need other good men in our lives to encourage us and to help us to move forward as we seek to live a life to the glory of God. AHM is about connecting men to live to the glory of God. If you want to know more about us, make sure you give us a call at the office, and Randy will get you set up in a community of men. For now, I'll turn it back to Steve. Steve?
Thank you, Scott. I appreciate the teaching today. I learned a lot, and I know I'm excited myself personally to go through the teaching more methodically with our men's group, which is what we're doing. And I think we're actually talking about doing that in the fall when the summertime is over. So thank you guys for watching. A couple of things here as we close out today's live stream or broadcast. We are a 501c3 organization, AHM4.life. And Scott says often, things that you support will go away if you don't support them. So support what you love or it goes away. And so if you feel like you are able to give support to AHM, please check out our website. There are options there for you to do so. And then finally, we do have the AHM CORE Teaching Manual that is available as of June 19th. And you can find out more information about how to get that from the website. You can call the offices and get some more information that way as well. Like I said, it is sitting on my nightstand, and I am excited to dig into that with my fellow men in my small group. So look forward to learning and growing even more than I have through the teaching so far, Scott. So
thank you, Steve.
You're welcome. All right, with that, we are going to close out today's teaching. Again, just ask comments or make comments, ask questions in the comment section below here on YouTube. Share this video with your friends. Help them to grow in the Word and grow in Christ. Again, AHM is here to bring men together so that we can live a life of meaning and purpose. And with that, we will close out today's teaching. Have a great day.